All right, so we keep the door open for a couple more minutes in case some more people would like to join us. Actually, the first row is still free, so we actually put the more comfy chairs in the front to entice you to actually come a bit closer, but it's fine, nobody's forced to, of course. So anyway, welcome everyone from my side. I'm Janis Grimm. I'm heading one of the research groups here, and I co-organize this event together with Mariam, who will introduce herself in a minute. And we're very happy to see you all here. There's a couple more people, of course, joining on the stream on YouTube, inshallah. And the way we're going to go about it, I'm going to say a few words about the lecture series of this event, about the institute here, or the center that we're building, about the topics, and then I'll end a bit of housekeeping, and then I'll hand over to Mariam to introduce our two speakers today. Well, to start with the center here, as you've noticed, it's called Interact, and it's a kind of a bit of a crooked abbreviation for Center for Interdisciplinary Peace and Conflict Studies. And it's a relatively recent research center here, and the idea was to bring together scholars of different disciplines or sub-disciplines to work jointly on issues related to peace, conflict, violence, revolution, intersections of law, knowledge production, and mobilization. And I invite you all to take a look at our website. We're still building up, and this is basically only the second event that we're having here at the center, the second public event that we're having here at the center, hopefully to be continued by a few more afterwards. The series here is called Interact Conversations because the idea was to create an event and lecture series that is visited by scholars that we are either inspired by or we always wanted to get in a conversation with, and now that we get the space, kind of we're using our privilege to invite people to come here and to talk to us about their work in a conversation with our work and through the angles that we are interested in. So the first event that we had in our series, you will still find some of the posters on the wall, was on New Frontiers on Imperial Rentier Capitalism, organized by my colleague Hannah, who's sitting here in the back, and it was about legal regimes of extraction and how we can think about them. So it was more on the intersection of law and imperialism, and this event that we're having today, titled Revolutions in Iran and Beyond, and I'll say a few words about that in a sec, is more at the intersection of what Mariam and I are working on, which is basically resistance and knowledge production about resistance and the knowledge politics of resistance, if you will. And the topic today is Revolutions in Iran and Beyond. Of course, Iran is in the main title, but if you look at the subtitle, it says Transnational Feminist, Kurdish and Social Mobilization. And the idea is, of course, that kind of the spark for this event is, as we all know, the major mass mobilization that we're currently witnessing or have witnessed and are still witnessing in Iran, sparked by the death of a young Kurdish woman, Mahsa Jina Amini. We'll talk about that name later on. And the ways how the entire world, if you will, has expressed some sort of solidarity with this very impressive resistance despite very severe and harsh repression that is still ongoing. But at the same time, the question how this international attention has also contributed to some hegemonic readings of the uprising that we want to question here. Basically, as a women's uprising against, hijab rules or a patriarchal theocratic regime. And labels have been given to this revolution that certainly do not quite live up to the complexity of the mobilization that we're witnessing at the moment. So, as a consequence, this iconic rallying cry that I brought here on a post-it from the event here in Berlin, "Women, Life, Freedom," has often been very much reduced to sort of a piece of evidence for the fact that this revolution is just an anti-hijab uprising. Of course, as images of women cutting their hair or taking off headscarves went viral, this was, further fostered such a bit reductive reading of the uprisings, and reality is, of course, more complex. And while I guess nobody's really contesting that Iran is witnessing some sort of a feminist revolution, it is much more than that. And what we want to take a look at in this conversation tonight is the intersections of different sorts of mobilization and how they all kind of figure into this revolutionary moment, and how this mobilization can actually be read not just as one revolution, but as actually as a feminist revolution, as a Kurdish revolution, as a social revolution, as many of these things and many of these stories hold true, that one way breaks with established patterns of resisting, but on the other hand also connects to a lot of ways how people have been mobilizing in Iran and beyond Iran's borders over the last years. So against this backdrop, of course, of these multi-layered meanings that came up in a few of these conversations that we're having here among colleagues at the center, we decided to use this format here to delve into this multifaceted story. And for this, we have two excellent speakers here, of which Mariam is going to say a bit more. But before Mariam introduces them, I would like to mention at least one person who unfortunately can't be there. That's Rosa Burch. She was on the initial poster, and we would have loved to have her with us. So Rosa is a PhD candidate at the Cosmos Center of Social Movement Studies in Florence, and she's currently a visiting researcher here at the Interact Center. And we had the initial idea for this conversation actually with her, and in our conversation with her about what we were actually witnessing here in terms of protest. But due to the many ways how the earthquake in southern Turkey and Kurdistan in northern and northwestern Syria has impacted her, and as many other people, she unfortunately currently feels unable to be here, so she sends her regards and her apologies for not being here. Also, since I'm already talking about it, I wanted to mention that we have a small box outside, so for donations, not for donations for us, but that we intend to send to Medico International, an organization for disaster relief that is active with local partners in southern Turkey, but also in northern and northwestern Kurdistan and in the Kurdish areas of Turkey as well. So if you would like to contribute something, of course, don't feel forced to, but you're very welcome to do so. And you can trust us that we will not keep it to ourselves there and put it into our budget, but actually transmit that to Medico after this event. Before I hand over to Mariam, and she introduces Tarek and Sanas to you, just a few words of housekeeping. So first of all, we will talk roughly, we'll have a kind of a closed conversation with a couple of questions that we prepared for our speakers for about 50 minutes to 1 hour here, after which we will open the discussion for your questions and your comments. And we kindly, maybe it doesn't need to be said, but I think it's important still to mention it. Let's keep the conversation constructive and respectful. We'll have roughly 50 minutes to 1 hour as well, depending of course on time for your remarks and questions. Then we look forward also to engaging with you over a drink or a couple of snacks or a glass of juice outside. Another word of caution also, of course, due to the sensitive nature of these topics that we're discussing. Please note that we're live streaming this event on YouTube, so the camera is there. It will be only directed at us on the panel, so you won't be on camera. But keep this in mind during the Q&A session afterwards. So if you prefer not to be recorded with your voice, then maybe just hold on to your question, and maybe you can just pose them over a glass outside after the event. I think it's just important to mention. Also, I'd like also to apologize in a way for those people that are joining us online, that we have decided not to open the chat on YouTube and not to facilitate like a hybrid conversation and so on, also due to the sensitive nature, and also to have kind of a safe space for discussion here without interruption, disruption, or hate speech. So if you have any questions that you cannot pose now but you'd like to, you're welcome to send them to us via email, and we will send them to our speakers and they may reply if they wish so. With that, I think I'm done. Maybe a final word of advice. The toilet is just down the hall on the left side, so if you need to, there's another one on the second floor. And with that, let's get to content, and Mariam, please.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Yanis, of the topic. And of the center, and I'm very, very happy to welcome Sanaz Azimipur today here. Sanaz is an activist and writer. She has a background in mathematics and gender studies, which makes for an interesting combination, I assume. And Sanaz has been active in organizing for migrants' rights in Germany for several years. And since last September, Sanaz is part of the Women Like Freedom Collective. And the collective is organizing demonstrations, among them the big one last year, of which Yannis took the sign that you just saw. But the collective is also doing some research and translation work, and in their own words, tries to make knowledge available here that is produced on the streets in Iran. And I'm also very happy to welcome Tarek Südik today here. And Tarek is a researcher at the Center for Conflict Studies at the University of Marburg. And Tarek has been doing ethnographic research in various regions in Iran. And as he himself says, his research covers a linguistic variety. And he has been covering cities and rural areas, religious areas and less religious areas, and also the Kurdish areas. He has been doing research in, among others, in mosques, in slums, in private and semi-private spaces. And he has a book out in German, unfortunately, but the title translates to Authoritarian Negotiations of Interests, How Iranians Shape Politics Within Authoritarian Frameworks. So you see we have two, as Jan has already said, excellent speakers today who will bring two very distinct perspectives on the multiple dimensions of the revolution or the revolutions we see in Iran, on Iran, on feminist perspectives, on Kurdish perspectives, on social perspectives. And with that, I hand over to Yannis again for now to start with the first questions, and then afterwards I will take over again. Yeah.
Right, thanks. So, initially, when we set up this conversation, we asked Tarek and Rosa to send us a few pictures that they, associated a special meaning to not just, use some of the images that are usually shared on news pages on the first, like in the first page, the most flashy ones and so on. And we asked them to send us some pictures, and Tarek has sent those pictures that we can see here on the wall. So these two, and then the one after. So my first, to get the conversation started, I was wondering to you, Tarek, since you brought these pictures, maybe you could briefly describe why you picked these images, what you associated with them, and then maybe also as a follow-up to Sanaz, because unfortunately and thankfully you stepped in on very, very short notice, but that also meant that you were not really able to prepare or bring any pictures. But if you had brought any pictures with you, right, which ones would be the ones that you would have brought? And what does the protest momentum mean to you personally and to you, Tarek, either in relation to the pictures that you brought or maybe also to the ones that you didn't bring, right? And how does that contrast as well with, the images that we tend to see about the uprising in Iran for the last weeks and months, actually?
Thank you very much. Should I just go?
Yeah, please go ahead.
If you could go one slide back.
Yeah, sure.
We're going to start with those two. And to me, this has been a period of time where we have the production of quite a few iconic imageries of protest and revolution. And these two in particular, I think they're quite correlated. On the left is probably a young girl protesting at the 40th day of the death of Gina Amini, and then on the right is also a young woman protesting because of the death of her mother at one of the protests. And to me, they're both interrelated because they show in their imagery, of course, the central role of women, the central role of the hijab law, and also an escalation in a sense, in terms of, we see if you think about how unveiling was a rather limited practice just a couple of years ago, how it became a very central practice during this round of protests, and it was even more escalated in terms of cutting off your own hair, another imagery that was quite deliberately produced. And at the same time, it signifies how the state violence that is supposed to curb these protests created further protests. So in particular, you see the death of Gina Amini, which in itself was a repressive practice, to curb any kind of resistance to the hijab law, then created these mass protests that we've been observing for the last couple of weeks, a month at this point, and then creating like these numbers of protests in a rather small town of Saqqez, I believe. And then on the right, also the reaction to state violence, which then creates even more protests, the death of her mother, which just intensifies the resistance to that system. And then maybe also the next slides. These were iconic images as well. There was the burning of Evin prison, very notorious prison, very famous one. It's by far not the only one, it's just the most famous one. And under mysterious circumstances, there was a fire going on. Still don't know quite for sure what happened. There's a couple of different theories of what was happening at that time. And you had the families protesting before that, of course, after that as well, but particularly during that fire to get their loved ones out of the prison. And what you see here right now is the protest to get the loved ones out of the prison. And also, to me, this was a very iconic moment of this round of protests.
So I know you didn't bring any, but you had just 1 minute of time, but like, would you have brought the same or?
I'm not sure. I'm also not sure. First of all, thank you for invitation and thank you. I'm happy to be here. Just a short thing is that I'm pretty sick. That's why that I might, I'm a bit too slow and I might need to take breaks in between. That was just important to mention in the beginning. So I'm not sure if I would have brought a picture or the same pictures because one of the reasons is that, one of the reasons also that this revolution was this time so much in the media was because of the pictures. And I think the pictures are very powerful. But despite that, I think there's just so much more than pictures that I would bring actually other medium, I would say. Here I would suggest a very good text that was written by Elle that was also translated to English and was published in Jadariya magazine. It's actually about the pictures of the revolution. So it's actually the name of the I can send the link to or share the link with everyone in the end. But it's exactly about this pictures and scenes. And what Elle says in this text is that what is interesting about this revolution is that every scene can be turned into a very radical scene. So it's not about people, it's not about figures, but it's about scenes. And each scene has the possibility to be converted to a very radical scene. And that could happen in any moment, and that could happen through everybody. And that means the way that she described it in her text is that each picture that we see, we think with ourselves, that could be me. So each picture of a person, of a woman who is, as we saw, for example, that we see on the graveyards, or that we see with the with the headscarf in the hand, we could see ourselves in it. So each figure, each person, each individual have this possibility to create this radical scene, and that's what is very interesting, or what makes this a revolution very radical in itself, because it's not about figures, but it's about scenes.
Mm. And would you say that this is would you say that this is something that gives this uprising a specific advantage, that it offers like a screening ground that so many people can project meaning into it?
I think so. I think if you want to, one of the questions that was broadly discussed in the last month was, for example, who is going to lead this protest, or who is behind, where are the center figures of these protests? And I think this could very much answer this question by saying each person and each individual could be at the same time also the leader. So it's not about, and I think what is hidden behind these pictures, I don't want to also over-interpret it, but at the same time, I think the possibility or the potential that these protests had was that it's not just about individual figures, but it's about going away from this also mindset of leaders and protests that need one figures and this individualistic or figure-centered demonstration, and take a shift toward sorry, movements that are led by people. And in that sense, each person in every scenario could in any moment will be the leader, and not just a participant, but also could create this movement.
Right. Maybe to pick up on that thought and play it back to you, Tarek. I mean, you've been doing research for a while on movements that have also been labeled, discussed as, or investigated through their horizontalism and through their coalitions that made up revolutions cutting across class, race, gender, political identities, and so on. And I'm talking, of course, also about the Arab Spring that happened in 2011 in large parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And like the Arab Spring, many of these revolutions are often portrayed through metaphors and images of a moving train or of a season, a spring that, comes and then goes, and you have an Arab winter afterwards, and then the springs come back again. And we have the same connotation, of course, in Iran, where once you had a green revolution, a green movement, a spring, if you will, that then abated and, if you will, is now back. So at the same time, these metaphorical connotations imply something of a regularity, of something that makes these protests comparable. There's a pattern to them, there's a lot of continuities. We can talk across cases about these revolutions. But at the same time, you have a lot of these fine-grained accounts of the nitty-gritty interactions of revolutionary moments that stress how these episodes are actually really, really messy in many ways, right? So they're very unruly, they're often very unpredictable, and each of them is, if you will, very special on their own terms. So I guess my question to you based on that is basically, I guess, one of routines and ruptures, or one of continuities and discontinuities, and what is different, what is the same this time. So, and Tarek, maybe you could elaborate a bit based also on the research in your book, or maybe Sanaz, you could also talk a bit about the similarities and differences on mobilizing abroad, if you will. So, is it all the same? Is it building on each other? What is different? Is everything different? And where do you draw distinctions, and where do you draw parallels and continuities?
Yeah, so for me, I would say that there's a continuity in the last couple of years, but there's definitely a change that occurred somewhere in the 2010s in terms of how protesters organized, the strategy they used, and also the state that they were facing at the time. So basically, if you look back to maybe the 2000s, protest movements very often aligned themselves to some extent with reformism. Oftentimes they didn't, but they knew that the reformism did exist and was a player that could be targeted, a player that could be influenced. So you have this idea that there is a legitimate opposition, and with that legitimate opposition, you can, even if you don't agree with it, even if you're against the system, you can still try to get them on your side. You have also theories by reformists at that time to sort of engage with civil society, to work with it towards certain reformist goals, but to not sort of erupt the system from within. So this is like a two-player game where both sides have an idea that they have a role to play. The legitimate opposition has a role to play, and the protesters have a role to play. What that resulted in is that there was a relatively high degree of civil societal organization, because it was to some extent tolerated. And particularly talking about leadership, there was a degree of leadership that was also tolerated and allowed. And that changed very strongly after 2009. So what we had after 2009 was the gradual decline. It wasn't actually that gradual, but definitely a decline of reformism as a political movement, as a political idea, and a lot of repression at the same time against civil society actors. And so what these civil society actors then did was, of course, they reacted to that new political environment. They maintained degrees of mobilization and forms of organization, but at the same time they were aware that this couldn't be as nationwide, as big, it had to be hidden under the radar, and this in many cases laid the ground of different types of political actors which are more insulated, but still exist, and they were able to sort of galvanize support on the street particularly in the protests in 2017, then also in 2019, 2020, 2021, and now we see that emerging again. And so we have this change that occurs in terms of the strategy, that it's not so much about creating a centralized nationwide opposition or to influence such a nationwide legitimate opposition through civil society activism, but rather a mix of being against the system as it exists, as we see right now very often in the revolutionary protest tactics, or in terms of just doing your own thing and ignoring the system that exists, maybe creating spaces where a different type of politics can be possible, a different type of politics can be imagined. And there I see a lot of continuity, because this has been going on for quite a while. It was very visible in the December 2017 protests. The mobilization for this has been going on a long time before that, in the 2010s essentially.
Sanas, what were these was this break or this shift that Tarek just described also visible within efforts to mobilize from abroad?
I would say that the mobilization is not very comparable, like in abroad, in compared to what is happening inside the country, and it has many different reasons. But the main reason is that the mobilization or self-organization is not happening the way that it can be done outside, because simply it's very dangerous. So it means that we see, for example, different calls to demonstration, or we saw this call to general strike, and we saw people coming out on the street, but it's not like, because of the repression and because of the, of course, very, very violent strategy of the Islamic Republic, it's not very possible to organize or to mobilize so many people in a legal way, in a way that the public could be reached. And I think that's at the same time also one of the biggest issues and one of the biggest problems of these organizations, because then you don't know, like every call for demonstration, you don't know who started that call, you don't know who is behind it, you don't know how to reach other people, you don't know if it's the right call or not. So that is one of the biggest challenge that I would say I heard a lot from my friends who are in Iran and are mobilizing the demonstration. So what happens a lot of time, I just try to transfer what my friend says, that that a lot of time people go on the street and they know that there is a protest happening, but it's not official. So people go on the street, and at some point, and that's why the scenes are important, because at one point the scenes will lead to a protest. So there's no open call for a protest, of course, because the government could, in a second, of course, arrest the protesters. So in that sense, it's not very comparable to what is happening in abroad, because in abroad, you go and register a demonstration, and with that you plan a demonstration, and then you invite people and speakers. So from that sense, I would say it's not very comparable, but also I think there it also shows what role or how close we are in abroad to the reality in Iran, which means not at all. I mean, we talked also about the demonstration in Berlin, and I think a lot of demonstrations that happened outside of the country were really important, and of course they were important because they brought so many people to the streets, but at the same time it's also it's important to say that they were just to also amplify the voices of what is happening inside the country, and at the same time it's not taking the place, or it's not playing such a big role when you're comparing it to what is happening on the streets of Iran, because it's also in that sense it's not, the protests are not happening on the streets of Iran. So in that sense, it can be just play a role to support the voices of the people on the streets, and it cannot take the place. So even if there are 100,000 people going on the streets of Berlin or, I don't know, another city, it is pretty important. It's nice to see that sign, but at the same time, it's not where the main fight is taking place, and I think we're not allowed to also forget that, because since September, for example, there were like each Friday after the Friday's prayers, people are going out in Baluchistan on the streets and demonstrating, and I think we have to again and again centerize what is happening there and these Fridays protests instead of what is happening outside of the country and abroad, even though it's important.
Mariam, do you want to jump in?
I think that fits
quite
pretty
well,
nicely to what I wanted to ask anyway now. And I mean, you just mentioned the general strike, and you also mentioned that you never know who calls for protests and whether it's the right thing to go now. And I wanted to talk a bit more about the intersectionalities that shape the revolutionary process that you've been describing already, and whether the two of you can tell us both a bit more about these intersections, about the solidarities you can see, but also about the frictions you can identify and what role they play. And I would like to attach a second question, and that would be, and maybe we explore together a bit on how the approaches and access to knowledge the both of you have as an activist and as an ethnographic researcher, how they differ and how they can complement each other.
So, in terms of the frictions that exist within multiple movements, I think really like the common sense within basically also like any anti-regime protest is this rejection of the system as it is, but there's not that much agreement of what should then come afterwards. And you see that in particular like also within slogans that are being used. But also in some of the ideas being not necessarily mutually exclusive, but at least attention to one another. So for instance, you have nationalist actors who very much reject the Islamic Republic, but at the same time have a very strong idea of national unity and also territorial unity. And you have other groups, particularly of ethnic and religious minorities, who have their particular rights in mind, who have a problem with this Islamicized nationalism, essentially, or with state centralization. And so those two ideas are at least at odds to one another. And similarly, you saw that when it comes to how women's rights issues were framed. So you have sometimes women's rights issues being framed as in a very feminist way, in a way that very particularly takes and centralizes the role of women. But also at the same time, you had it being used in terms of look what they're doing to our women. And both of those frames that exist, they both have the same conclusion that the state, reject the state, or the state is the problem, but where they come from is very different, and also how they envision the future is very different. So I think there's quite a bit of tension there. On another level, class is always a huge issue, and one of the biggest problems for mobilization for a very long time was that there was a missing link between the urban middle classes and the working classes, and also the rural peasantry in particular. So there you have economic interests and social interests which don't necessarily align with one another, and very few strategies to overcome that. So for instance, when we talk about a general strike, one of the questions that comes to me is, who's funding the general strike? Because the labor movement is been hit by sanctions very harshly. This has been hit by the economic situation very harshly. So it's quite difficult to maintain a general strike when there's no access to funds and resources, which the middle classes might have or might have more access to. But there would need to be a strategic alliance, maybe an organizational alliance, which is very difficult to maintain under authoritarianism, but which also is difficult to argue for ideologically when there's quite obvious differences in terms of policy and in terms of goals that are being pursued. So there I see quite a bit of tension here. I immediately forgot the second question.
I can also ask it later. Someone can go with the intersection first and then I come back to the second.
Yeah, actually, I found what you said, and especially in the end, I found that that's one of the reasons why the general strikes are not going on that much as it was going before, because I mean, in the end, the people who are risking their lives are now the workers who have to then count with their loans every day, and they're anyways the people who are being affected by the poverty and the classism that is happening in Iran like since 44 years anyways, and because of that it can never be sustainable as long as we don't have options like, for example, the Casa for the strikers, or we have certain kind of funding, like fundings in a sense of civil society kind of fundings, where there are ways that civil society actors also play a role together to also in a like with solidarity to collect money for the strikers. And because this possibility doesn't exist, the strikers or the strikes cannot go on in a very sustainable kind of way. So I see that. At the same time, I think when we talk about working class and middle class, it's also very important to contextualize it when you're talking about Iran, because I think the understanding, or in general, the definition of middle class is very different from country to, of course, from any geopolitical situation to a different one. So I think when we're talking about middle class in Iran, we have to also define what we mean by middle class, because like, of course, the sanction politics and of course the economical corruption, but also economical violence that the Islamic Republic is based on since 44 years, also completely ruined the middle class. So that means that most of the people who are living in Iran are living in poverty, and if they're not living in economical poverty, they still don't have access to political and economical capital, which means that even for the people who are not working in a precarious situations or have a better working situations, for example, and have contracts, are not workers, for example, even for them, they won't be categorized into middle class, because in that sense, there is no middle class when there is no access to capital or no access to political power or to any kind of other resources. So in that sense, I think it's very important to say that also, of course, the fight that is happening in Iran has also this more dimensional and intersectional aspect, but also that's the same as the Islamic Republic's oppression. So the oppression that is happening inside Islamic Republic has a lot of has also multi-dimensional aspects and perspective, and I think one of the things that is missing a lot of times in the analysis in Germany, but also in abroad, is that we're talking about gender apartheid, we're talking about freedom, women's freedom, equality, and hijab, right to self-determination. But the thing that is missing a lot of times, and most of the times, is the class aspect, because that is the way that the Islamic Republic was built, and that is the way that the Islamic Republic was also ruling in the last 44 years. So the Islamic Republic as a government is not just based on gender oppression, but it was built on class oppression. And that means that if you look at the workers' situation, for example, if you look at the movements in the last 44 years, the teachers' movement, the retired movements, the worker movements, the illegalization of any kind of syndicates or any kind of unions, you see how the class oppression was working in the Islamic Republic. And like one of the main also politics of Islamic Republic was to use and instrumentalize the sanctions that are being affecting Iran anyways, especially on the working class. So that means that I would say this politic of poverty and politic of a class is one of the biggest elements of Islamic Republic, and it's also one of the most important instrument of Islamic Republic to oppress people in various ways.
That was very insightful, I think. So I'm going back to the second question, which I still think will tell us a bit more on how to complement the picture. And maybe I phrase it a bit differently this time. So what can we see if we bring ethnographic research and activist knowledge together? Do we see different things? Do we see different aspects of these intersections from like your approach to knowledge production and from what you said, like bringing knowledge from the streets of Iran here? And I mean, of course, both of you work differently with regard to how you produce knowledge, how you transfer it. What would you say? How can we bring this together, and how can these different perspectives benefit from each other and complement the picture?
So, particularly the way that I was doing research, I was talking a lot to activists firsthand, and also drawing from that knowledge that they have accumulated themselves. So this is not necessarily that I came up with it reading books. I'm very much relying on that particular activist knowledge. So I think the idea is to have contextualized knowledge. So for example, in particular, how I was trying to do it, to have very heterogeneous and different perspectives from activists, but also contrast them, which in a way also challenges some of the beliefs that some of the people that I talked to would help uphold themselves. Because I was talking to other people in other parts of the country who would maybe contradict them, or just not agree with them. And then I tried to sort of get the gist of it, or make sense of those tensions between those points of view, and then of course contextualizing them a little bit more historically rooted throughout the period of time I was looking at. So in that sense, I think what ethnography can do is take these different first-hand accounts and perspectives and contextualize them both within the moment through a heterogeneity of perspectives, but also beyond that, looking a little bit back and forth in time. That would be my take on this.
I think what I can say also from my observations, I think one of the problems that I see is exactly this gap between the academic knowledge and the gap and what is happening on the street, which is, I think, in general a problem of this gap between activism and academia. So what happens there is that I think a lot of time the movements or what is happening on the streets cannot really compare or connect the struggle to the other struggles that has happened. And I think in that sense, something that is very important for the revolution right now is first of all is to compare these revolution, the strategies and the goals, the challenges to the similar revolutions, at least in the last 20 years, that happened also in that region, but also to compare and talk about different, for example, workers' movement, different strikers' movement, unions, the situation of other feminist uprisings. And I think that is exactly where, like, our responsibility, if we can say that, our responsibility is to fill out this gap by the privilege that we have outside of the country, to connect this knowledge that has been produced, of course, in the last 100 years. The knowledge can also be the knowledge that has started from the beginning of 19th centuries till today, and on the other side bring the challenges and the struggles that are happening right now on the streets, and to somehow connect these two fields with each other.
Yeah, I think that leads pretty nicely to what I still have here on my piece of paper for questions, and that is the transnational dimension. And I was wondering, like in general, how is this revolution a transnational one? Across the region on the one hand, but also maybe cutting across boundaries of the global south and the global north. And then I brought 2 points of critique with regard to the transnational dimension that I saw both of you expressing. And for Sanas, that would be, you expressed a lot of disappointment with the German left in an interview. Maybe you can say something about that as well. And Tariq, you expressed quite a bit of critique of some parts of the diaspora, and in particular the Persian majority, and maybe you can say something about that as well.
Should I start again, or?
I don't mind. Maybe give Sanas a break to catch your breath, and yeah, you start.
So, in terms of the transnational dimension, this is one of the things that I'm always a little bit bothered by, to think of. And it's something we also discussed when planning this event, particularly also with Rosa, to think of any type of social dynamics just in the container of the nation state. It's quite problematic because some of the regions are just simply transnational. We'll get to that in a second, but also because there is very often a sense also amongst Iranians that Iran is a very special place that is a little bit disconnected from the rest of the world. And it really is not. And if you live outside of that space or that mindset, it's very evident, but sometimes it's a little bit hard to get through with that. We've had that discourse also in Germany about the special role of Iran, or why Iran is special, or why it's very important. And yeah, every place is special in a way, but they're also quite interconnected. And for instance, you see that how other countries look at protest movements in Iran. Other countries in the region, for instance, don't perceive Iran as a country that is outside of the region. The women's rights movement in Afghanistan very early on picked up on the women's rights movement in Iran. And they also interconnected to some extent. There were slogans being shared. There were solidarity protests in Kabul with Iranian protesters. You have throughout Arab-speaking countries many people commentating and also observing what is going on in Iran. You had similar processes, particularly after the 2009 movement, where strategies were also being quite closely examined to see, well, what does work in our country, what doesn't work in our country, and also autocrats do that. So it's not just civil society, autocrats very clearly look when something happens, and they learn from repressive tactics, they learn what works, what doesn't work, and they also prepare themselves for their own protest movements. I think this is one of the dimensions. In terms of regions, I mean, the protests started in Kurdistan. The protests started in the Kurdish majority regions of Iran. They used a slogan that originated in the Kurdish areas of Turkey. So there's already in that a transnational component where Kurdish civil society doesn't operate within the containers of the nation state. It operates across those borders and transregionally. To a lesser extent, that's also true for the Baluch experience. Baluchs experience discrimination both in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and in Iran. And in that sense, like this experience of state violence is a historically rooted one that goes back to the 19th century, and that Baluch across borders share, and that also can increase, for example, reactions to state repression, but also creates a certain type of community and shared understanding of where we are in the world. And I think so in that sense, it's quite important to look at the transnational dimension in particular. And yeah, finally about the criticism of diaspora actors. I mean, it's particularly like I've been looking at how these diaspora mobilizations have been going on. And I think there's been some very valuable things as well. So I wasn't criticizing the diaspora, in particular.
You said some parts of
yes, yeah, no, just for everyone else. But yeah, there also have been a lot of infighting. There have been attempts to hijack parts of the movement. There have been questions of leadership in particular, where it's not quite clear to me where that claim of leadership originates in. because there isn't really a diaspora actor, as far as I know, that has ties to any organization in Iran and can claim to be involved in the protests that are going on. So where do claims of leadership originate in? Is this the diaspora talking with each other and agreeing on something and then sort of going into Iran and saying, now accept that? Or does that originate in organizational legitimacy or some claims to having connections on the ground? And I don't see the latter part. So I'm very hesitant to anyone who claims any type of leadership or to speak for Iranian protesters, because I don't quite see where that would come from.
Yeah, I wrote down some of the things that you said that I wanted to also say something about. So first of all, I will start with answering your question about the German left. I think this is one of the problems that I saw in the last month, or honestly also it really shocked me from the beginning that of course there was also a lot of solidarity. I mean, if we see how many people took part in the demonstrations, how many people went on the streets in Berlin, in different countries, of course it was like I can see that, but at the same time I feel like what was missing, or what is still missing, is the different leftist, internationalist view of what is happening in Iran. And I think one of the reasons for that is that, or at least one of my observations for that is that in general the movements from global south in global north will not be taken seriously, or will not be acknowledged at all as a movement by the leftists. And that is one of the problems, that the movements will not turn into this our ideal picture of the transnational, internationalist feminist movement, and they will stay like that. I mean, we saw that also with the biggest strikes of the farmers, for example, in India 2 years ago. That could be actually the revolution, the socialist revolution that we are always talking about, but it didn't happen because of the ignorance that we see and the lack of acknowledgement that we see from the actors in the global north. And I think that is one of the biggest problems that I also am observing about this right now's revolution, that even though this is, or I mean, it depends how we frame it. I don't want to say that all the people who are going on the street, as Tarek said, are representing feminist mechanism or values or movement, but I would say that a lot of things, slogans, movements that we saw in the last couple of months would tell us that that movement is a progressive movement. It is happening for the feminist values, for the feminist solidarity movement. And I think there I see the possibility for us to, or for the people who identify themselves with, words and labels like solidarity, social, leftist, feminist, abolitionist, to actually to learn from it and to connect and join that struggle instead of taking distance from it and say, yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure if that is what, I think that's what I observed, was that a lot of people who would normally talk about this abolitionist revolution would not be interested in what is happening in Iran. And I think that was, for me, very shocking, because you're like, that is what is happening. Like, of course, you cannot also expect 99% of the people who are going on the street to say this is a socialist revolution. It's never going to happen. And I think there you also see this gap of the knowledge of the, I would say also academic left in global north to the real living reality of what is happening in the street. That a lot of time, of course, people will not use the same labels, people will not use the same academic knowledge, but at the same time, if you look at the mechanism, you see it's the same thing. So what I mean is that if you look at the general strike, then you see actually the worker movement. But at the same time, you need to acknowledge that even if that is a bit different from what we are imagining of a revolutionary movement, this could be a revolutionary movement. And I think this is, in that sense, I think I was a bit disappointed, or I am still a lot disappointed in that, because of course when the left movements are, or when the at least leftist allies miss this possibility to join allies and to build leftist allyships and organize themselves, then what's happening is not that the movement will in general not happen anymore, but that the right wings will take it over. And I think that is like obviously also what is happening everywhere, and that is what we can also observe right now, that there is now this allyship or whatever coalition of the conservatives and of the right wings that is happening in Iran, including also the royalists and the monarchists. And I think for that we need to see, or we need to also question the role of the leftists in the global north, and actually their lack of responsibility in what is happening, in actually to create what we expected the whole time from a transnational solidarity. That didn't happen. And I think it's still not too late. I think it's still, if we look at what is happening on the streets of Iran, and if we look at the movement, we need to realize also that that is the time also to create also strategic ways of allyship for the feminist groups, initiatives, for a lot of groups that identify themselves with words like, or labels like socialist, leftist, or any group that wants to go toward the path of radical democracy, social justice, and to question that part. And I think if we can join alliance on that, then I see a very big possibility right now. As Tarek said, this whole thing started in Kurdistan, and we see that it's also going on in Kurdistan, and it's going on in Balochistan. So for that, there is a possibility to talk about self-determination, transnationality, feminism. But for that, we need to also, I would say the leftists in the global south need to first acknowledge that what is happening there is also radical in itself.
Maybe I can jump right into that, because actually you already said, you just said it's not too late, right? So my question would go, so Donatella Laporta, who's worked a lot on revolutions, has, she published that book, Where Did the Revolution Go? And I don't want to phrase it that way. I would like to ask you before opening the floor, so if you have some questions and comments, now would be a good time to think about them, raise your hands, and Mariam will take notes. And while you do so, I would like to phrase the question differently. So how is the revolution going, actually? And going back, maybe we start with Sanaz this time, going back to what you mentioned before, between the parallels of different revolutions in the region or beyond, right? So often we tend to think of revolutions as wildfires and something that is completely, it's just exploding, a country going up in flames and so on. And Mark Beisinger even has compared it to hurricanes, where he said, you have rules and regularities how they develop, right? But whether they hit land and create disruption or just die out at sea, that's still, very contingent. So given this kind of messy and blurry picture, I was wondering, where do we stand right now, and what potentials do you see where we might be heading? Is it like, which track are we on currently? And maybe you could give us your thoughts, and then Tarek, and then afterwards we open it up.
Yeah, I think each revolutionary process has different phases, and I think it's pretty obvious that we are now in a different phase than the phase that we were experiencing in September, October, or even November. And that means that the protest on the streets, the demonstration will be different. They're not as present as they were before. But right now, we are experiencing a new phase in which the alliances are being built and coalitions are being built. And actually, I think in this phase, it's very much more important to think about our demands and our imagination of the future that we are expecting for the country. Because right now, I'm now back to my a bit activist perspective on that. Right now, actually, there's a lot going on for the 8th of March, for example. If anybody also wants to join, you can also talk with me after that. What is happening is that a lot of feminist groups and initiatives and actors and activists are coming together to actually build alliances for 8th of March, to use this momentum again to say, hey, we're here, we're practicing our agency, and as long as this revolution is going on, we're here. And I think that is very important to not forget that even if of course, the conservatives and the right wings will be there. I think it's also very important to also acknowledge their part, in a sense that, say, Iran has 80 million people, and a lot of them are also, a lot of people, millions of people are living in the diaspora, and conservative groups and right wing's perspectives also belong to that. So there is a whole majority, or there is a whole population from super right to super left. And as long as I think this country will exist, these people will also exist. I think the importance is there to acknowledge also our role and our agency and our goals. And because of that, I think that is exactly the moment to build these alliances and to write, to imagine, to talk, to discuss the possible scenarios for the future. I think if we are talking about feminist movement, it's also very important to say imagining scenarios about future is a feminist act, in a sense that you are imagining a different future in which is not just only not what is happening right now. So you're not just opposing the right now structure, but you're actively imagining it, imagining different scenarios of a just future in which people are living in more justice, in more economical, social, gender kind of justice. So in that, I think now is that, it sounds a bit utopical, but I think right now it is exactly the time to talk about these scenarios of the future, to talk about what do we mean exactly by democracy. Right now we're talking a lot, in social media, I would say there's a lot of talk going on, discussions about the path that leads to democracy. So I think right now is also a time to question also our definition of democracy. What democracy do we want? Do we want the democracy that is being practiced, for example, in let's say European countries, or is it actually the time also to talk about what are the options of radical democracy? How can we actually maybe take steps toward the democracy that serves also not just the majority, but also everyone in the country? What is our understanding of the national state, nation-state construct in the future? What is our understanding of economical structures and so far? So I think right now it is very important to bring down the ideas, and right now it's very important to talk about the futures and the scenarios of the just future. And to build alliances based on that.
Yeah, so in terms of where we are with the revolution, I actually, just very briefly before the protest started, I wrote an article arguing that protests are imminent, they're coming, because the regime as it works at that time wasn't really working anymore. It was also sort of the result of my book that the regime couldn't really last the way that it was doing politics in 2021. So really a larger movement was imminent. To me, that was very evident. At the same time, and we saw that basically through the last decade, and we saw that again over the last couple of months, the quickest route towards a revolutionary regime change, which would be elite defections, that is very unlikely to happen. This has been very deliberately done by the regime to prevent elite defections, to constrain elites, to constrain the political space, to consolidate power around Khamenei. So I think it's very unlikely that we see that quick path towards a revolution. So what we do see instead is the longer path, which is to overwhelm security forces, to exhaust security forces, to cause the system, the entire system, to tumble and to break down. That is much more difficult. It takes a lot longer. So in that sense, it's also very unlikely to happen within one revolutionary episode. It would take multiple of these episodes, each of them being bigger and stronger than the last one until such a type of regime change happens. And while that will, for protesters, give options of everything Sana's just explained, it also gives the regime windows of opportunity to change course, to find better ways of repression, more effective ways of repression, to make concessions, to play out actors against one another. So this is basically what we will see. And I think my sense is, at least for this year, maybe over the next couple of years, the regime trying to sort of prevent this from coalescing into a larger movement, to keep it boiled down to a lower level, maybe to the level that we see right now, and protesters always trying to get the next bigger step to escalate a little bit further, to then make the regime basically crumble and have a regime change. And yeah, it will be seen like who has the better strategy for this. And to me, like this is basically the standstill where we are right now, where it's very difficult to tell who will come out of this more successful.
Thank you. That was a lot of nice input, a lot of food for thought. I'm sure a lot of you have questions. Maybe just, Mariam kept a bit of track. You may say your name, or you may say a different one, but it would be nice to have some way that the speakers could address you. And please direct your question to either of them, or say who the question is directed to, okay?
Yeah, I think the first question here in the blue pullover, then in the very back, and then here's the third one. And maybe we collect. Yeah, we collect three, and then we do the second round. And I have Sophia as the first person on the second round. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm Anna, and thank you very much. Like, it was really mind blowing to have all these different points of view. And my question is that I kind of observed a way how European government kind of instrumentalized also the movement, and to kind of it reinforced their position of democratic leaders and of their own politics. And for example, also the pictures of this young woman in front of her mom's grave, thank you, was being invited by the President Macron, and he kind of completely used this image to speak of liberal democracy, and to kind of reinforce his own international leadership. And you spoke about radical democracy, and it's really interesting to have completely a new shift of what really means democracy, what really means liberties, what really means social justice. And I wanted to ask a question also about, you spoke also about the coalitions, and there is this coalitions called the Futures of Iran's Democracy movement that took place. And I wanted to have maybe of you both some kind of a critical opinion of what was being discussed during this big, it was in a university in the US, I think, and
So,
Maybe regarding to this,
Georgetown.
yeah, exactly, regarding to their goals of secular democracy and what you named as radical democracy.
Yeah, I think we collected 3 questions. Yeah.
So hi, my name is Wolfgang. Thanks so much for this super interesting talk. I've learned a lot. My question is maybe a semantic one, and maybe Tarek answered it in his last bit. But it was a little bit, I noticed just the wordings in terms of protests, uprising, and revolution. And revolution to me implies some kind of an end state already, or a done deed, let's say. I guess it's very hard to judge without trying to obviously lessen what people have done in Iran. Kind of my question is, I guess, where has the revolution already happened, or has, for example, the social revolution already happened? Because, like you of course said, regime change, in that sense, the revolution hasn't happened. So yeah, basically my question would be, what of all these changes are permanent, maybe, or where has this revolution or these uprisings now really changed, or left its mark in Iranian society?
I think I didn't completely understand.
So the question is basically, what is revolutionary about all of this in terms of how does it really question structures?
Yeah, basically. I guess in the sense of, has some kind of revolution already happened, and if so, which one specifically?
Yeah, maybe a third one, and then we answer. Yeah.
I think my question is from Sana's. I think understanding and positioning Janjan Azadi or Zanzani Ghazali in Iran, a whole transnational feminism is still unfolding. And among this, I want to ask you about Masih, because for those people who don't know about Masih, she's the one that started, I think some years ago, the White Wednesday and unveiling practices through social media. So encourage young people on Wednesday to take out their scarf and put it on social media. And she did a lot for the whole woman in Iran. And personally, I have some kind of sympathy with her, but it's always really hard to make a kind of sisterhood around her because of the whole, the way she does and the whole coalition that she always do with right wing in US and in the West from the time that Trump was and until now that she talked with Peter Jefferson. So it's always for a person like me that I'm a little bit familiar with neoliberal feminism, but I'm not very familiar with right-wing feminism. I don't even know such things, could exist. But here we are. We have someone like Masih Alinejad, and I want to know if you see her a feminist, and if talking about Masih Alinejad is useful in terms of dismantling feminism South Globe and positioning that in the whole transnational feminism.
I would suggest that we now give you the chance to answer because I think that were already like 3 quite substantial questions.
Should I start? Yeah, so the first question, I wrote down, I was trying to find it. The first question was, I think, like, as you said, there has been a lot of also right wings, especially powers in global north that were from the beginning instrumentalizing this for their especially nationalist and racist agenda. I mean, the good example was, I don't know if you watched this video of the CDU politician who is right now saying, yeah, look at what is happening in Iran, and in a really weird shift of how things happen in Germany, is using what is happening in Iran and the fight of the people in the streets to say, why is it okay to racialize people here in Germany? So I think that has happened before, and I think it's gonna happen also. I think a lot of time also what happened in the last 6 months, at least in Germany, was this question of, are people in Iran pro or against the West or Western values, or what is it? What are they standing opposing the Western in general? So I think like that was also that is also one of the problems, because I think it puts also it puts a certain kind of framework on the struggle that doesn't have anything to do with it. So I mean, the question of people, for example, being on the streets or pro or against Western values, whatever that even means, is already putting like binary duality framework on the struggle. And like as you said, that the example of Macron inviting her was also one of that things, because like in my opinion, at least, it was also somehow trying to say, oh look, this is, or they are, somehow we are standing in solidarity with them because they are also representing neoliberal values of feminism, which is, I think, very connected to what you said. And so I think that is what is happening, and that is what has happened before. We saw that also with Masih al-Najad, who was like in the last 5 years basically like everywhere in all the news. And I think it's also a pretty good match for this very reductive image of this also binary, you're either a victim or you're this I don't know, this super woman with like wind in their hair and flowers and everything. So it's, I think it's very also important to also for us to break this binary in a sense that of, I think we need to remember all the time that we are more than the reactionary voice to what is being oppressed or what is being put on us. And because of that, I think it's really important to, again, to when we're talking about like liberty or about liberation movements or about feminist movement, it's about, again, thinking about not what we are opposed to, but also what is our imagination, or what is that, what we want, and what is the radical democracy. And I think this will happen from now on. I mean, we saw that even Alice Schwarzer said that she's standing in solidarity with people in Iran. We saw a lot of people from super right wings to super left wings to Angela Davis that said they're standing in solidarity. And I think what we need to do, or at least I think the next step will be trying to question all of the existing structures and trying to build new discourses. Because I think the most dangerous thing is to get stuck in a reactionary movement, and through that not being able to create any new discourse, and discourse about democracy, discourse about justice, discourse about also fighting. The second question about is this a revolution or not, I don't know. I think there has been a lot of discussions in the last months about if this is a revolution, and I don't have any certain kind of definition of what a revolution is. I think if we look at the demand of the people in the street, it's pretty clear that they say we don't want that. And we don't want that means that they're already rejecting the system that is existing, which is the Islamic Republic. And with that, I think it's pretty obvious for me that the revolution has started. A revolution in a sense that people don't want the existing system. If this revolution will be successful in a sense that there would be a change in the system, and there would be a new system, I cannot answer that question, I hope, but that hasn't happened. So if the revolution was successful or not, or will be successful or not, I can answer, but if that in general was a revolutionary movement, I would say definitely yes, because I mean, people are from very different also classes, races, genders, are very clearly demanding a change in the existing system and the structure and everything around it. So it's not about reform or it's not about change. And even the strikers are not just now striking for a better working condition, they are asking for a system change. The last thing, I think you also answered the question of if there is a right-wing feminism. It's exactly like white feminism and nationalist feminism, and I think it's very, very dangerous. And I think right now we see also the danger of that in the last month, and in what also back to your question, I didn't watch the whole thing, to be honest, because I was pretty sick, but I read a lot about it, and I also watched the summary of it, and from my understanding, so far there wasn't even a plan or a strategy or a goal. So because of that, I cannot really I don't know. I know the people, and
I think what I read is that they are now working on their manifesto.
Exactly.
So it's like an announcement, like a big announcement of working on a manifesto.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So there was nothing to also, accept the speeches that you see. And I think right now what is very, very dangerous right now is when you look at, for example, the speeches of Reza Pahlavi and the people who took part in that, where they're using, they're creating these new nationalist discourses about human rights, universal human rights being written based off, Great Persia, whatever, 2,500 years ago. You see that this is actually the shift that can happen, and we see that historically that was also very, that was a shift that happened after many revolutions, after many movements, this shift from actually a movement that could lead to a radical change and a progressive future, but instead led to a new nationalist, racist and right-wing scenarios. So I think because of that, I don't and I think in the case of Masiha Ali-Najad, I think it's very important to also differentiate herself as an actor. I think I also see her work. I don't want to dehumanize her, and I think it's very important for me, at least, because of what is happening to her on social media and everything, to not dehumanize her as a person, but at the same time criticize her work as a person with a lot of platform, with a lot of also political power right now, to question her ideology, and to also, for me, it's also very important to distance the feminist values from the transphobe, racist, right-wings people and groups that she's now being identified with.
Going in a similar direction, so I'm going to start with the Georgetown conference. I honestly don't know what they said, because I'm not particularly interested in tweets and announcements by celebrity activists. For me, it's more interesting what is actually materially happening. So if they had a social base, which they don't really, then I would be interested in it. If there was already a manifesto that I could see they're galvanizing sort of these things on the street that people can't articulate on the ground, and they're putting it into a bigger platform. If they do that in a couple of months, then I will probably look at it. But at this point, it seemed more about the persons involved than about the processes on the ground. So in that sense, it was quite a disconnect to me. I think generally what these attempts at diaspora mobilization are doing is that they're not really, their audience is not so much what is happening on the ground in Iran, because they don't have the influence, they don't have the social base, they're very difficult to actually influence that. The audience is more Western audiences, so to be sort of a legitimate partner or someone to talk to for governments in the West. So I think that's sort of more the idea here. And then it would be also interesting to see to what extent they also have claims to be the ones in charge of a transition once the revolution comes. because that's something that's been always like played around with, it's sort of hinted at, but the second you make it explicit, you also open yourself up to criticism. But that would be really interesting to see whether that's actually a claim that's going to come or not, and particularly with the son of the last Shah, that's going to be a whole new story. In terms of the revolution, I'm also, like, I would also always distinguish between speaking of revolution as an analytical category and as a political category. So analytically, of course, revolution is decided afterwards. Historians will say this was a revolution because these things happened and there was that change. But like in the moment, calling a process a revolution is a political claim. It's saying we want there to be a revolution. We want a revolution to come out of this. So in that sense, I'm also very hesitant, sort of as an academic or as an analyst, to assign that label to something. But I do very much accept it when activists assign that label to them, because it's activists saying this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing this, and that has to be taken seriously. And in terms of like where it has already been successful, I actually wrote an article on this over the weekend, and I think like there's a couple of things that we can point to. For instance, about how the hijab is being dealt with right now, it's becoming a mass movement to unveil yourself. But also, I think quite a significant development has been that this idea of any type of legitimate opposition, of any type of third actor between the Khamenei loyalists and the anti-regime actors, like this intermediary sphere, is just gone. It was gone also a decade ago, but now even you hear reformists saying that actually we don't believe in that anymore. And you see more and more the question being, do we want the system to continue as it is, without reforms, pro-Khamenei, or do we want the system to just go away and have an entirely new system? And this polarization of politics, I think, it's been going on for a couple of years, but this was sort of the end point where I think like it's very difficult to turn back from this, to reinvigorate any type of reformist movement. I don't see a path for that right now. And also, I think this is something that also is to some extent irreversible. Basically, for the last couple of decades, when we talk about Iranian civil society, we very, very much talk about urban, Persian-speaking, middle-class, NGO-affiliated actors. That's not the only ones that are there, but that's the ones we talk about. And what we saw right now was a huge reclaiming of that narrative by particularly ethnic and religious minorities, who now also maintain mobilization, while mobilization in the cities has gone down quite significantly. And they have established themselves as very important actors. So no matter what system comes afterwards, they will have to speak to Baluchi and Kurdi actors. Whether Khamenei survives this somehow, he will have to at some point make concessions to Baluch and Kurdi actors, or he will have to increase repression or find some other way of dealing with that. But he can't ignore the regions anymore. If there is a revolution and we see a post-revolutionary order, it will be very difficult to have that without the inclusion of minority rights, of self-determination, of having some voices in particularly Baluch and Kurd communities. There are also other minorities that would also have to be addressed, but just to name the biggest ones, which have been very active in mobilization. So they've shown what they're capable of, and I think that in itself is irreversible and that constitutes a major change in how Iranian politics play out.
So, Sophia and any other people with questions right now? Otherwise, I would say go ahead and then we see whether any other questions follow up in the like.
Yes, that's great, because I'm sorry, I have to go in 10 minutes, so I was going to ask whether you could answer my question directly anyway. So thank you very much for this really interesting talk. Firstly, I also want to thank you explicitly for talking about the need to develop discussions, open discussions about the future. I think this is not something that the Iranian revolution needs, but that is also really something that the left in Germany and Europe could really benefit from, especially having discussions, open discussions about the future beyond technocratic frameworks, right, which seem to dominate. So thank you for reminding us all of that. And yes, that leads me to my first question. I mean, the left in the global north is in disarray. I mean, it is in danger of disappearing, definitely in Germany and Britain, for example, right? Two traditionally very strong, actually countries with strong leftist movements. So I was quite surprised by your disappointment in a way, and that, I don't think it's a laughing matter, because it might actually speak to kind of post-colonial mindsets that are still hovering over these like ideas of the need to somehow have a transnational solidarity with the strong left north. So in front of that, I was just wondering whether you could both talk again about the need for solidarity from the global north. Like, is this actually something that's important, and if so, why? That's my first question. And my second question is, I would be very interested to hear your opinions or knowledge about who are the regime's allies, both domestically and also internationally.
Yeah, I would say then we just go ahead with this question.
Maybe you want to start?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the second part with the regime's allies. I mean, internationally, it's always a bit contentious because Iran has a lot of, like not a lot, it has allies, but it doesn't have a lot of very close allies. There's tensions in the relationships. Russia, for instance, is a common ally, but they don't always have the same interests at heart. That was quite evident, for example, in Syria, where they both supported the Assad regime, but at the same time they had diverging interests when it came out of how that's supposed to play out. They have different visions of how the region is supposed to work, and they do cooperate, for example, now in evading sanctions to some extent. So there's been reports about Russian administrators trying to find out how the Iranians have been doing it for the last decades, because if anyone is an expert on how to evade sanctions, it's the Iranians. So they try to learn from that, and also, for example, weapons deliveries and that economic exchange, but that has limits, and has very clear limits, and it's always contentious to some extent. Similarly, we see that with China. There's generally this autocratic alliance that you see worldwide. By the way, Hungary and Poland just congratulated Iran for its 44th anniversary, unlike any other European countries. I'm just going to leave that as it is. And China also has close relationships with Iranian officials, but not too close, because China has different security interests. China generally pursues more economic interests than a political agenda in the region, so it doesn't agree with everything that Iran is doing, and it tries to also play out different sides, also balance sides. So it's careful relationships that they have. The Iranians have been very successful also at building local allies, particularly with militias and non-government officials throughout the Middle East, but also in other countries. So I think those are some of the ones that come to my mind, and also which have been very crucial in undermining sanction regimes in particular. They're not necessarily allies that can come in and bring in troops to defend the Iranian state. I don't think either Russia or China would do that, which Russia, for instance, has done with other allies in the past, but it wouldn't do that in Iran. But they can support each other economically and to these types of support, and also on the UN level. So that might happen, definitely. Yeah, in terms of domestic allies, they're still the loyalists, and we can't quite say for sure how big that group is. I tend to be a little bit more on the side of it's a slightly larger number. Could be maybe like 20-30% of the population, maybe a little bit less than that. But yeah, it's very difficult to make any concrete answer here. But you have the military apparatus, which has been really bumped up a lot. It's a completely parallel society in many cases. They go to their own schools, they have their own neighborhoods, they have their own economic branches. It would be very difficult to argue that any type of protest really influences their opinions. And similarly, in terms of people who are really embedded in patrimonial networks, who rely on the state to continue, and who very often is very personalized, rely on Khamenei specifically to survive. And so, yeah, because they have these aligning interests, it will also be very difficult to convince them to switch sides. To some extent, that's been happening already, but it's difficult because they remain allies of the regime as it is. Yeah, I talked a lot about allies, and I forgot your first question. I'm very bad at remembering stuff.
Transnational solidarity.
Transnational
Whether
solidarity.
it matters at all.
Oh yeah, of course. I think revolutions ultimately come from within, so it matters, but I wouldn't assign it too much of a value. It can influence how foreign governments interact. It can influence informal support networks. But ultimately, it has to be fought on the ground, and revolutions can also succeed with very limited international solidarity. But what I would also say is that while maybe the northern left might be in disarray and there might be huge barriers to supporting each other, you see a lot of protest movements, whether they're left or not, it's not always quite clear, but you see a lot of these anti-authoritarian movements across the global south. And they have been inspiring one another for a very long time and been quite successful at that as well. And also copying tactics and sending solidarity notes to one another. And I think this is sort of the type of transnational solidarity that is also often very overlooked, but which plays a very huge role when we think of not just Iran, but about revolutions in general, because protesters also know quite keenly what has worked in other places and what didn't, and take that up when they design their own strategies of survival.
Yeah, to complete what is said, I also think, like, I don't see you. In the first week of the protests in September, when the demonstrations were happening on the street, you could see that the women in Kabul and in Afghanistan were also going in front of the Iranian embassy and protesting. And I think that itself is a very, very important message of why transnational solidarity plays an important role. And as Tara said, I think you see that kind of solidarity. You saw that also in different kinds of Kurdish region in Khorasan in Turkey, in Syria, and also in other regions that were taking place in the first weeks of the Iranian Revolution. But I think the reason of why we need, or let me reframe, I think actually this revolution doesn't necessarily need the solidarity from international community. I think the international community needs the solidarity or needs to learn from what is happening right now, because I think like if we look at, for example, our knowledge, or I don't know, like I don't want to use the word decolonize because it's being like overused in all of the like everywhere. But I mean, if we're talking about decolonizing also knowledge, it's very important to also think about which movement is being acknowledged and which knowledge is being, or which knowledge is being labeled as a knowledge and which not. And I think in that sense, a lot of the knowledge is being produced in, for example, about social movements, about feminist movements, about feminist theories, is lacking this perspective that is from other geographical region, other contexts, other political regions. And I think because of that, it is very important for the leftist, whatever that means, how even though there are few people maybe, it's very important to use this knowledge in order to build also next generation knowledge perspectives fight based on that. So I think I see that as a potential actually to when we're talking about, I don't know, feminist movements and feminist revolution, it is important to acknowledge that as a feminist revolution, not just because we want to support the voices of people in Iran, but because we can then see possibilities of the same thing in other regions. And then we can see the strategies, the organizing, the mobilizing, and actually use it and, export it to different regions. So because of that, I think it's very important for the international community to acknowledge it and to also, join and connect that struggles, to learn from it actually, and to also build up a stronger leftist alliance based on what is happening right now.
I think we have still time for, two more questions. One here, one there. Yeah.
My name is Mark, and question to both of you, but maybe especially to Tarek, since you mentioned that you think there need to be more revolutionary episodes like that and even stronger ones. But don't you think, both of you, that there's also a danger that people lose hope? Because At least that was my impression, and people were very hopeful. And now they saw that so many died, so many were sent to prison, and the violence that happened. And in the end, you could say nothing changed. You said things have changed, but not as people had expected. And we also saw in other countries that, I mean, hope is also a very important part of such a revolution.
What you said right now was something I wanted to ask from the beginning, I think, because like what can people producing knowledge and being active in the global north can learn from this movement right now? Like what is new, what we can like learn within academia and also in activism?
So about the revolutionary episodes, also I'm gonna keep it brief because I think I would be also interested to hear your opinion on this. When I did fieldwork in 2017, like I was struck by how disillusioned and also in many ways hopeless people sounded about the political system. So throughout the protests that happened then, was it maybe December 2017, November 2019, in the summer of 2020, 2021, it never really struck me that hope was the main motivator, but it was actually hopelessness, desperation. And in that sense, I don't think that seeing that, oh, it didn't happen now, so now I'm hopeless, it's never going to happen, is something it's likely to occur, because I think the sentiment was more, or the emotional that I got from people that I was talking to, was that I don't actually believe necessarily that it's going to happen. I don't even know if it's going to happen, but I still have to do it because there's no other way right now. So this was the sense that I was getting, but I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this. So I don't think that will necessarily influence the situation, because to me, hope wasn't the biggest motivator here to begin with. In terms of what we can learn, I think there's quite a few things. Just starting and then stopping at some point. No, I think the importance of decentralized mobilization. I think this is something that we've seen in multiple cases, not just in Iran. I think this is something, Sudan is always an example that comes to my mind, where you see forms of the centralized mobilization, to a lesser extent, but also in Hong Kong. So a lot of different types of mobilization across the world, where you don't have an organized opposition, because autocratic regimes stopped allowing these a decade, 2 decades ago. So they know that every time there is some sort of nationwide organization, even if it's apolitical, at some point it becomes political. So then they stop having that, but people still are unhappy. So then they start mobilizing in a decentralized way. And this shows the potential of these decentralized mobilizations. Because until a couple of years ago, we would say, oh, this happens, but it's not going to lead to a revolution because it's missing that link. And now we see that in the moment, that link can happen. And this is, I think, a quite significant lesson. The other one for me would be to really change the way we think about civil society. Maybe this has been an argument that I've been driving home for a while, so I'm a little bit opportunistic here at reiterating that. But when we think of civil society, we tend to think of NGOs, we tend to think of the same kind of actors. We like having our checkbox civil society, we like to have our actors that we're familiar with, who sound like what we expect in civil society here as well. But in particular, if you think about peasant actors, if you think about really the precariat going to the streets, they have very low levels of organization, very limited organization, but they might have some form of social organization. They might have some sort of shared spaces that they engage with, very informally, but when that moment comes where different types of mobilization can coalesce, these can then work in a way to mobilize people. So in that sense, they do things that civil society does without really fulfilling any of the definitions or checkboxes that we have for civil society usually. So this is also like one of the lessons that I would draw from this. That's
Thank you. I think, I would say I agree with your all of your points. The first point about hopefulness, I think the perspective that I have is very subjective, right? So I'm not looking from outside, I'm looking from inside. And because of that, I would say that, as a person who is also going through all of these phases with the revolution, I then have also different feelings that I don't know which of them is representing what is happening in the movement and which of them is mine. But I just wanted to say that it's super subjective what I'm gonna say. But I would also say that what I observed in the last, or experienced also in the last years, was this desperate hopelessness, so a kind of collective depression that you could see, especially after each protest that happened in Iran. Like in 2018, in 2019, each time that a protest raised and happened, and then after that it was brutally, of course, repressed by the government, there was a new wave of collective depression inside the society. And of course that was also going on with the new sanctions, with the economical situation that was getting worse and worse. Then there was Corona. So the last time that I visited, for example, Iran, I couldn't really compare it to the country that I left when I left the country, because the amount of this, what I would describe as collective depression, was so high that it's very unbearable for the people who are living in it. And imagining this movement and imagining this revolutionary process in a situation like that, for me, was very impossible. And so when that happened, I think there was also this new wave of euphoric hopefulness that was injected to the whole society that we saw through demonstrations, through this being decentralized, through civil disobedience. And I think their hopefulness then was a very important tool, because that was for the first time after a very long time that people, and including me, had that feeling of, oh, that's actually possible, or the change, or this imagining this change is possible, and I have an agency. So I think I'm thinking out loud. So I think at that moment, that was also the moment where people had this feeling of collective agency that wasn't denying the system of oppression, but at the same time was somehow reflecting on their own agencies on the street. And this agency could also be protesting, but also could taking back the body that was taken away by the Islamic Republic. So the people who were going on the street and taking off their headscarf was also practicing their agency. The people who were striking and not going to work for a day was also practicing this agency. And what I see in this agency is also a sense of hopefulness, and not optimism in the sense that, oh yeah, we're now super hopeful because everything's going to change, but because you don't have, because hope can also be a very radical tool, and it could be a very radical feminist tool to believe that the change is actually possible. And this hope is coming from agency, and this agency is coming from actually resistance. So what I observed was this hope as a revolutionary tool in the first month. And like you, I am also pretty worried about this hopefulness, or this instrument being taken away by the repression and by the government. But I also at the same time think that like the revolution itself, this instrument is also coming with waves. So I think hope is also something that goes and comes and goes, and as we interact also with the world outside of us, we see that there's always, new things. We see now these coalitions conservative coalition, then there would be new alliances that are reacting to that, and through that there would be new feminist voices, and through that will be new hopes and new ways. So I think in that sense I would say that I am still, or I would decide to stay hopeful, not because I'm optimist, but because I think there's no other way in order to make a change. So that's our only instrument. And I think that's also not something that is a cliche, but it also comes from a reality of resistance, and that is something that we can learn also, especially from the Kurdish movement. If you hear the slogans, for example, it's one of the most important one is called Berkhodam Jiana, which means resistance is life and life is resistance, and it comes from not a point of optimism but a point of resistance. And I think that's why it's very important to also always remember that we're fighting for life and we're fighting for hope and that we're fighting for another future. And I see that that's gonna also happen. And of course now it's a different wave, but new waves will come. I don't know when, but it will interact with each other. So I think that that's about hope. But at the same time, I don't want to also deny the fact that a lot of people, a lot of activists, a lot of people inside and outside of country are very much disappointed. And I think this disappointed or being tired or being even depressed is part of it. And nobody will talk about it because you also think, I Googled yesterday, post-revolution depression to see if something like this exists. What?
Was it?
No. Well, because of that, I think that it's a thing. At least I can observe it from our group. Anyway, and the second thing, to talk about what we can learn from what is happening there. I think Tara answered your question very well, but I would also say that I think we can learn civil disobedience and how effective that can be, especially right now. This whole topic about civil disobedience is very hyped in Germany, and to ask, I don't know, should we glue ourselves to the floor or not? I think it's very important to see there are very different and various different forms of protest, and we need to take them all seriously and acknowledge them. So I think what I saw from what happened in Iran at least was that there are multiple thousands different waves of forms of protest. Like, I don't know if you saw the videos, but when people decided, and especially women decided to take off their hijab, there were also other people who were motivating them by, they were even called chocolate people, because they were the people who were giving each other chocolate. So people were interacting with each other without wars, in which you're practicing solidarity. There were people who opened their houses to the protesters. There were people who went to the prisons. There were doctors and nurses who were voluntarily helping the protesters. And you need to know also that there's a lot of risk with that. There's a lot of cost with that. But nevertheless, people were practicing it, even if it means going on the street with your car and like honking your car. It was still a form of protest. I think this is something very valuable, and this is also something that we really need to, or people need to learn in the global north, especially when they're thinking about organizing. And also, another thing is that for all of this, I think we need to also practice the culture of empathy, like honestly, because otherwise I don't think that would happen authentically. Because I think a lot of time especially in the last years in the activist circles here in Germany, what I experienced a lot of time was that there was this will, of being in solidarity to each other, to create safe spaces, to create spaces where we can practice sisterhood, alliance and everything, but at the same time, because you can't inject it this empathy, and this can also happen overnight. And as long as there's this empathy gap and there is this lack of solidarity that you're practicing on every day, you can't forcefully bring people and make circles of activism that is based on empathy. And I think that is something that is being a lot of time overlooked in activist circle. And I think the first step could be also learn from that.
I think that was a really nice closing word, because it showed both the complexities of what's going on, that we maybe need hope, that we shouldn't despair, but maybe also despair is part of it. And I would thank the two of you for being here with us today and for sharing your insights. And I would also thank the audience for listening so carefully and for the questions that also sparked another round of discussion. And I would invite all of you for a glass of wine, water, juice and snack outside, and to stay with us here for now and continue the discussion for a bit.
Maybe